Let's get into it. Okay, so let's start off with the basics. What exactly was the Zakarum Inquisition? Well, as it turns out, there's actually a couple different ways to answer that question. On the most basic level, the Zakarum Inquisition, otherwise known as the Time of Troubles, was an era of suppression launched by the Zakarum Church that occurred in the early 13th century. But understanding why this era of suppression was launched and what ultimately came of it gives us a much better understanding of what the Zakarum Inquisition really was. So let's rewind a bit and get to the root of it all. The origin of the Zakarum Inquisition can be traced back to the reign of Quahigan Zebulon I. Now, if you aren't already familiar with the title Quahigan, allow me to enlighten you. Essentially, the title Quahigan was held by the head of the Zakarum Church, the religious order of sanctuary. Think of it kind of like Pope, but instead of the Pope, we have the Quahigan. So Quahigan Zebulon, I ascended to the role at a time when the Zakarum Church had become increasingly corrupt and decadent. Despite the efforts of the Zakarum High Council, Zebulon had become convinced that the church had strayed far from the teachings of the Triune and had become too concerned with material wealth and power. So he launched a movement to reform the church, attempting to bring it back to what he believed were its more ascetic and humble origins. Now, even though this movement was wildly popular with the common folk, it did not sit well with the Zakarum High Council, who were very happy with the amount of power and wealth that they had accumulated over the years. As such, they actively worked against Zebulon's efforts to reform the church. For his part, Zebulon resisted the Zakarum High Council's influence over him and refused to bend to their wishes. Unfortunately for Zebulon, though, his resistance would eventually come at a cost. You see, the position of Quahigan was hereditary, passing down from father to son. And when Zebulon died, his son, Quahigan Bogus the Younger, ascended to the role. Unfortunately, Bogus was not nearly as strong-willed as his father, and he quickly fell under the influence of the Zakarum High Council, undoing much of the progress that his father had made in reforming the church. Now, while the High Council had managed to turn Bogus against his father's teachings, they had not succeeded in turning the populace against him. The people still greatly supported the ideals that Zebulon had championed, and they hoped that Bogus would come to see reason and resume his father's efforts. But unfortunately, Bogus would go on to disappoint them, and he would do so in a big way. In the year 1225, Bogus would pass away, and with him, the hopes of the people for a return to the old ways would die as well. With Bogus's passing, the Zakarum High Council finally saw an opportunity to undo the damage that had been done to their authority over the church, and they wasted no time in seizing it. They quickly set about finding someone whom they could manipulate into doing their bidding, and they didn't have to look far. As it turned out, Bogus's younger brother, Quahigan Karamat, was more than willing to help them in their quest to restore the Zakarum Church to its former glory. In Karamat's mind, he saw himself as merely continuing his father's legacy by ridding the church of what he viewed as heresy. So, Karamat eagerly agreed to help the High Council enact their vision. In turn, the archbishops allowed Karamat to ascend to the role of Quahigan, and together they would usher in an era of religious fervor and oppression. Under Karamat's rule, the church became much stricter, with harsh punishment being handed down to anyone who did not conform to the new standards of worship. Missionary work took on more martial overtones, with the church sending out crusades to punish those who did not believe in the Zakarum. Any who resisted the Zakarum's teachings were declared heretics and were often brutally persecuted for their beliefs. Other religions, such as Skatsim, were not exempt from this persecution either. In fact, these other faiths were often targeted even more heavily than those who simply did not believe in the Zakarum. The Zakarum deemed these other religions to be evil and sought to wipe them out completely. Anyone who could not prove that they were free of demonic influence or corruption was judged as being inherently evil. And if they were found guilty, they were subjected to horrific interrogation techniques and horrifying purification rituals. The goal of these rituals was to cleanse the individual of their corruption. However, more often than not, these rituals ended up killing those who were subjected to them. While this was certainly a dark time for the people of Sanctuary, it was especially brutal for those living in the lands of the East. You see, around this time, the church launched a massive campaign of conversion against the West, forcing the native populations to either convert to the Zakarum faith or face death. To carry out this plan, the church created a new order of paladins known as the Hand of Zakarum. These holy warriors spread across the lands, purging any who resisted the Zakarum's message. Those who could not be converted were deemed evil and were killed. And so, the Zakarum Inquisition spread through the lands like a tempest, laying waste to all suspected of demonic possession or corruption. It was during this time that the cages of binding were created, crafted by the followers of Zakarum to imprison malignancy. The Inquisition used these cages as a tool of interrogation, believing that they could use the darkness imprisoned within to extract information from their victims. However, the experiment proved to be more difficult than they had anticipated. Even after consulting with the scholars of Orbe Monastery, they were still unable to effectively use the cages. In response, the archbishops ordered that experiments be carried out at Karamat's Reach, an outpost located in Hawazar. Under the supervision of Orbe Monastery, these experiments resulted in the development of a more powerful form of cage, which was able to successfully kill the malignant creatures. The archbishops then ordered that Karamat's Reach be sealed and the cages confiscated. However, the Inquisition's grip on power would eventually begin to falter as time went on. Around the year 1247, a group of paladins broke away from the church, disgusted by the heinous acts that they were being asked to commit. These rebels condemned the methods of the Inquisition, proclaiming that the new order of paladins should protect the innocent rather than punish them, and that the evil corruption was rooted in their forebears' failure. And so, these rebellious paladins left their Zakarum brethren and ventured west. However, the number of paladins who broke away from the church was still outnumbered by those who remained, and the remaining zealots continued to propagate the horrors of the Inquisition until the movement finally began to fade away. But despite the eventual downfall of the Zakarum Inquisition, its effects were still felt for many years to come. In fact, the leader of the rebellion himself, Aldician, would go on to lament the damage that had been done by the Inquisition, calling it one of the darkest periods in human history. Speaking of figures from the past, how about we take a look at the personal belongings of a man named Deckard Cain? Deckard was a Haradrim scholar who lived during the time of the Zakarum Inquisition. He played a pivotal role in helping the rebel paladins escape the wrath of the church, and he went on to become one of the most important figures in the fight against Diablo. While sifting through his belongings, we can find a few interesting items, including this letter, which sheds some light on what life was like during the darkest days of the Zakarum Inquisition. In the letter, Deckard expresses his sadness over the loss of life that has occurred as a result of the Inquisition's crusade. He laments the fact that so many innocent people have been slaughtered and that the Zakarum Church has become a symbol of fear and oppression rather than hope and salvation. He also expresses his frustration with the church, his unwillingness to listen to reason, and their stubborn adherence to their own dogma. One of the things that makes this letter so heartbreaking is the realization that it was written by someone who was once a member of the Zakarum Church. Clearly, Deckard was once a devout follower of the Triune, but he became disillusioned with the church's teachings and left to pursue a life of scholarship. However, he was still deeply affected by the atrocities committed by his former religion, and he could not bear to watch as innocents were slaughtered in the name of the Zakarum. This is especially evident in the final lines of the letter, where Deckard expresses his hope that one day the people will be freed from the tyranny of the church, and that they will be able to live in peace. Overall, this letter is a powerful reminder of the dangers of religious extremism and the importance of tolerance and understanding. It also highlights the courage it takes to stand up against oppressive institutions and the hope that one day we can live in a world where such atrocities are never repeated. Thanks for watching. Sources: in-game codex entries, the Book of Cain, Diablo Wiki,